A lot of Yu-Gi-Oh players have been playing the game for a majority of their life. They saw the anime as a kid, or maybe their older sibling played, and something about the game just stuck with them. But sometimes the format isn't enjoyable, or external factors get in the way, and you take a break or quit. But I always hear a lot of stories where people find their way back to Yu-Gi-Oh! I stopped playing around 2014, and picked it up again in mid to late 2016. And for context, I was just playing at school, not competitively or even at a local level. But when I jumped back in, I was ready to dip my toes into competitive or at least more constructed play. And the deck I chose to build for some reason was DDD. If you know anything about DDD, it's not exactly user-friendly, and my reintroduction to Yu-Gi-Oh! Became more of a first encounter, as I effectively relearned the game through the lens of the different dimension demons. But I did fall in love with the deck, and I feel like I also picked it up at the perfect time. Support was rolling out regularly, and the structure deck was set to be released in early 2017, and the deck did perform extremely well at full power, but its reign was shorter than expected, and maybe even shorter than what it deserved. And in today's video, we're going to discuss the journey of DDD and why its peak was so brief. But before we get into it, I have three important things to mention. I'm specifically looking at DDD between 2015 and 2017, which leads to my second point. I won't be discussing every card that came out in that time frame. We'll stick to the most commonly played cards in the archetype. And three, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now let's get started. The DDD archetype debuted in Clash of Rebellion, which was released August 7th, 2015 in the TCG. There was already a DD series of cards that also stood for different dimension, but they weren't part of this archetype, although they do feature in a lot of the artwork. The deck's claim to fame is that it uses all of the extra deck summoning mechanics, so Fusion, Synchro, Xyz, Pendulum, and eventually Links, although they didn't exist when DDD was created. And thematically, DDD is a bunch of things. It's scientists, mathematicians, world-ending events, mythical creatures, and the corporate hierarchy. But I think it's most known for the historical leaders. You've got Alexander the Great, Caesar, Genghis, and a bunch more, but we'll get to them a little later. And as I mentioned earlier, Clash of Rebellion was the start, but interestingly, it was Dimension of Chaos in November of 2015, which introduced most of the cards you know. Although it is important to mention that Oracle King Dark and Marksman King Tell came out in Clash and were both crucial at certain stages of the deck's life. But Dimension of Chaos was the debut for 17 new cards, which is an absurd number. But we're going to cover the significant ones. I think the best place to start is with Necro and Swirl Slime. Swirl Slime has an effect in hand, which allows you to fusion summon a DDD fusion using monsters in your hand, including itself. And when it's in your grave, you can banish it to summon a DD monster from your hand. And it pairs nicely with Necro Slime, which has a grave effect, allowing you to fusion summon a DDD fusion monster by banishing material from your graveyard, including itself. So if you open both, you could use Swirl to fuse in hand, and then use Necro Slime to fuse in grave. A fairly simple combo, and for me, it was probably the easiest interaction to learn on the deck, as the synergy is very clear. The next monster to cover is Baphomet, which can change another DD monster's level to anything between 1 and 8. Baphomet has been completely phased out now, but the level altering effect was important for summoning the deck's Xyz monsters. The only nitpick about this card is that it can't change its own level, which would also be very helpful. But unlike Baphomet, the next card stood the test of time. DD Savant Kepler. It does have a pendulum effect, but we're going to skip straight to the monster effect, because on summon, it can either bounce a DD card back to your hand, or add a dark contract from your deck to your hand. It's the main normal summon of the deck, and leads us into the dark contract cards, which are so important to the strategy. They're continuous spells and traps that burn you for 1000 during your standby phase, and it's important to note that that's a mandatory effect, and it's effect damage. You're not paying life points. Dark Contract with the Gate is a Rhoda, allowing you to search any DD and making it a 3-of in the deck. Swamp King lets you fusion summon a Fiend monster, and then if it's a DDD monster, you can banish material from your grave as well. A lot of early builds I saw ran 3 Swamp, but the more support we got, the less you needed to run. And the final contract of note that came out in the set was Dark Contract with the Witch. This lets you send a DD or Dark Contract from your hand to the graveyard to pop a card in your opponent's field, and it buffs your Fiend monsters by 1000 points on your opponent's turn. Witch is a good card, but having a card to send from your hand can be tricky. Once you're done comboing, it's unlikely that you'll have a discard for the effect. But going back to the monsters, we next have Oblivion King Abyss Ragnarok, which kind of begins the trend of ridiculous names. Its effect reads: if you special summon a DD monster except during the damage step, you can target one DD monster in your graveyard. Any battle damage your opponent takes becomes halved for the rest of the turn. Also, special summon that monster, and if you do, take 1000 damage. You can only use this effect once per turn. If this card is normal or special summoned, you can target one DDD monster in your graveyard. Special summon it. You can only use this effect once per turn. Once per turn, you can tribute one other DD monster, then target one monster your opponent controls. Banish it. Regardless of how you use it, it's a monster reborn, and an on-the-field banish could be very useful as well. And this card wasn't hard to summon because you could banish Swirl Slime from your grave to get it out of your hand. You could also pendulum summon it, but I never found myself pendulum summoning that much in this deck. Prior to Gilgamesh, it felt more like a deck with pendulums as opposed to a pendulum deck. And the last notable main deck monster from Dimension of Chaos was Rebel King Leonidas. As I mentioned earlier, I picked up DDD in mid to late 2016, so I missed the earliest phases of the deck, and one of the most interesting things to me was the inclusion of Leonidas, especially seeing it at 3 in most lists, because by the time I started playing, it was already phased out. It can summon itself when your contracts burn you, and you take no effect damage while it's face up on the field. It's not a bad card, but I only saw the utility in it keeping you alive. But these early DDD decks could use Leonidas and Dark to make rank 7s. A lot of builds I saw would max out on Dark in the extra deck, and include the likes of Gaia Dragon the Thunder Charger, Big Eye, and Red Eye's Flare Metal Dragon. This is pretty foreign to what DDD is now, and what it would be just 2 years after 2015, but the card pool was smaller, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Players still found a way to make it work. And it's also pretty interesting watching deck profiles from this era, and seeing people talk about Dark and Rebel King preventing you from getting burned, because games took more turns, so burning yourself to death was a real concern. It could still happen today, but it's not as much of an issue. And finally, the extra deck monsters, which are the stars of the show, starting with Oblivion King Caesar Ragnarok. In the early stages, this was kind of the boss monster of the deck. When it's involved in battle, you can bounce a DD or Dark Contract card you control to equip an opponent's monster to it, and it gains the attack of that monster. And there's a few important things to note about this effect. It doesn't target, which is awesome, and there isn't a limit to the amount of monsters you can equip. So as long as you have cards to return to your hand, you can use this effect. Wave King Caesar has a weird battle phase reborn effect, but I think the most useful aspect of this card is that if it's sent from the field to the grave, you can search for a Dark Contract. And lastly, we have Duo Dawn King Kali Yuga. After this card is Z-summoned for the rest of the turn, other cards and their effects cannot be activated on the field, and other card effects on the field are negated. Once per turn, quick effect. You can detach one Xyz material from this card. Destroy all spells and traps on the field. You can detach one Xyz material from this card, then target one Dark Contract spell or trap in your graveyard. Set that target. This card is pretty crazy. It negates everything on board, is a heavy storm, and can reset your contracts. Interestingly though, this card got a lot better later, as many decks could rank up into it on your opponent's turn, and effectively turn skip them. The only issue was that making a rank 8 was not very easy with the cards from Dimension of Chaos. Ragnarok was a level 8, and Baphomet could change another monster's level, but it became a lot easier with Savant Thomas, which was released in the Dark Illusion in August of 2016. It lets you pop a DD card from your Pendulum Zone, and then summon a level 8 DDD monster from your deck. Thomas became a staple of the deck, with some lists playing it at 3, but most deciding to run just 1. Continuing into 2016, that September we got the Megatins, and received the promo cards Flame King Genghis and Gust King Alexander, which have very similar effects. If a DD monster is special summoned while you control Genghis, you can special any DD from your graveyard, and if it's destroyed by an opponent's card, you can recycle a Dark Contract from your graveyard. If a DD monster is normal or special summoned while you control Alexander, you can special summon a level 4 or lower DD from your grave. Alexander, Genghis, and Ragnarok meant the deck had 3 monster reborns, and the way these cards can loop monsters over and over is incredible, as we'll see later. Genghis was immediately put into the deck, being able to extend your combos further, but on release, Alexander was unplayable as the deck didn't have a tuner monster, and Alexander requires 1 DD tuner, but that was going to change in 2017. Structure Deck Pendulum Domination released January 20th of 2017, and this was really the moment DDD went over the edge. This was originally supposed to come out in the TCG July of 2016, but was replaced by the Felgrant Structure Deck. And this delay was extremely significant, as we'll see later, but this does partially explain why there was no tuner when Alexander was released in September 2016, as there already should have been one available if the Structure Deck came out on time. There were a lot of new cards in this product, like DD Night Howl, Cerberus, Orthoros, and Beowulf, but the 3 key cards that completed the deck were DD Savant Copernicus, DD Lamia, and DDD Cursed King Siegfried. Starting with Copernicus, on summon, it can send a DD or Dark Contract from your deck to the grave. Copernicus provided the deck with a second normal summon, and the Foolish effect was very useful. You no longer had to play a card like Armageddon Knight, which is outside of the archetype, and you could dump cards like Swirl Slime, Necro Slime, and the new tuner, DD Lamia. If this card is in your hand or graveyard, you can send one DD or Dark Contract from your hand or face up on the field to the graveyard except itself, special summon this card, but banish it when it leaves the field. You can only use this effect once per turn. By today's standards, this effect might not seem crazy, but in this deck it was. Alexander, Genghis, and Ragnarok are all monster reborns, and then Lamia can summon itself, so you could summon this 4 times in a turn. This is one of the cards that tripped me up a little bit as I was learning the deck and relearning Yu-Gi-Oh! Because you can send a DD Pendulum from your hand to the grave for the effect, but you can't send a DD Pendulum from your field because pendulums go to the extra deck if they leave the field. But Lamia was crucial for summoning Cursed King Siegfried, which can quick effect negate a face-up spell or trap on the field until the end phase of the turn. And when it's destroyed, you gain 1000 life points for each dark contract you control. These two cards and Alexander turned DDD into a synchro deck more so than a fusion one. Players started to run fewer copies of Dark Contract with the Swamp King, and they started filling their extra deck with cards like Odd Eyes Meteor Burst, TG Hyper Librarian, and Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon, which is pretty expensive at the time. When people talk about DDD, this is almost always the version of the deck that I think of. I enjoy modern versions that are a little more Xyz and Pendulum heavy, but this to me is just iconic. Nothing epitomizes this era more than the end board of Siegfried, Crystal Wing, and Hope Harbinger, which could be achieved with a very simple 4-card combo. Place Ragnarok in your Pendulum Scale. Use Swirl Slime's effect in hand to make Genghis. Normal summon Lamia. Use Lamia and Swirl to make Alexander. Alexander's summon will trigger Ragnarok to summon Genghis from the grave. Genghis will trigger Alexander to summon Lamia. Lamia and Alexander will make Siegfried. You'll use Necroslime's effect in grave using Gust King and itself to make Beowulf, which will trigger Genghis to summon the Lamia. Use Genghis and Lamia to make Meteor Burst. Meteor Burst will summon Ragnarok from the Pendulum Scale. Ragnarok will summon Genghis from the grave. Overlay for Hope Harbinger. Lamia's effect will send Genghis to grave, special summoning itself, and then Lamia and Meteor Burst will make Crystal Wing. There were various combo lines and paths, but this was the ideal end board, and I imagine a lot of people sat across from this end board because this deck was everywhere. Jeff Jones won with DDD at a Hartford ARG tournament, and then DDD won another ARG in South Carolina, and then another in Georgia, and a regional in Switzerland, and then a second one in Scotland. Pendulum Domination ultimately lived up to its name as it propelled DDD to Tier 1 status. It finally had all its pieces and was making good use of them. The deck could also make use of Allure of Darkness, which was reprinted in Pendulum Domination, and Pot of Desires, which had come out the previous year in the Dark Illusion along with Thomas. And this was still around the time when some argued Pot of Desires was a neg 9, but it worked really well in DDD as you ran all of your key cards at 3, so you would have a very small chance of banishing a playset. And the final two non-archetypal cards that I saw in a lot of these deck lists were Soul Charge and Vanity's Emptiness. Basically two auto-win cards if either of them resolve. Soul Charge would generate so much advantage that it's almost impossible to lose, although you'd have to consider the burn damage you take from your contracts. And on the other end of the spectrum, you could set Vanity's Emptiness after doing your combo, and when combined with 2 or 3 negates, the game was effectively done. And although DDD was dominating, 2017 was ultimately defined by a strategy that came out only a few weeks later. The most common narrative as to why DDD's run was so short is the most accurate, and that's because of Raging Tempest and the release of Zodiac in February of 2017. And just to be clear, DDD was still playable after Zodiac was released, but Zodiac was just a different animal. On paper, the DDD endboards may have looked a lot better, but the resources put into those endboards is what made the difference. DDD was doing 3 or 4 card combos, which were actually somewhat consistent in how often you'd open the pieces, but Zodiac was hyper consistent with its 1-card combos. Zodiac Rat Pier was full combo, Barrage was full combo, Tenki was full combo, and you could even run the Speedroid engine to make MX Saber Invoker to bridge into Zodiac Rat Pier. Just a different level of consistency. And with that consistency, the deck was able to play a lot of non-engine that was pretty devastating, like Ash Blossom, Ghost Ogre, My Body as a Shield, Solemn Strike, and Dimensional Barrier. The other major factor, which I alluded to earlier, was the delay of Structure Deck Pendulum Domination. There's no guarantee DDD would have been the best deck from July 2016 to February 2017 if the structure deck was released on time, but it certainly would have been a contender. But generally, I think timing and delays have always been something that DDD has had to deal with before and even after the structure deck. For example, the reason Dimension of Chaos had so many DD cards is because they were being imported from the Raging Masters set, a deck build pack that we never got in the TCG, and the pack included Genghis and Alexander, but they chose to release them in the Megatins instead. And in regards to Link format, in general with how slowly Konami released the links from the Link Brains packs, we had to rely on Wee Witch's Apprentice and Master King Archfiend prior to Gilgamesh, which were not ideal options. And I think the final factor may have been the complexity of the deck. I don't think this played as much of a role as Zodiac and the delay of the structure, but if you could play a deck with a high win percentage but is complicated, or a deck with a high win percentage but is fairly simple, you're gonna pick the second option. And I think that's something that still plagues DDD to this day. Not saying it's comparable to the current meta, but you can get the same or better results just playing something a lot simpler. But DDD did get its time in the sun, even if it got cut short. But it has had competitive relevance since, like in 2022 with the support from Battle of Chaos, and in 2025 with Doom of Dimensions. In hindsight, I could have picked an easier deck to learn, but I think it was perfect because of how much there was to learn. I think one of the best feelings in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is picking up a new deck and learning how to master it and adapt it to your playstyle. But that's the video. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel. What got you back into Yu-Gi-Oh! Or what is it that keeps you playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Leave it in the comments below, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.